Thank you for talking with us today. Could you introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about you?
My name is Jeff Bejma. I guess I'm a self-professed history dork. Late at night, while some people are, watching TV or whatnot, I tend to read a lot of books. So I'm just kind of anything I get my hands on, I try to read it, and for whatever reason, I can retain it. So
That's the hard part sometimes,
Yeah.
is the retaining. Now, but you go beyond just reading books. You actually document things that have happened.
yeah, and I mean, I always try to find what else. So when I moved to Fells Point, all I ever heard about was the War of 1812. War of 1812, War of 1812. Some captain stayed here, War of 1812. Great. What else happened in the neighborhood? So I started looking into a couple of the buildings and started to stumble upon a history that was pretty ridiculous. So to take it a step further, I would go over to the Maryland Historical Society and start looking through all their historical records, looking at deeds on buildings, tracing names, going to penitentiary records, seeing who these people are. Let's face it, murder and mayhem always makes for fun stories. So I would start leaning more towards that and started to find a underbelly of Baltimore that is often not talked about.
And what is that underbelly?
The underbelly is essentially the origin of or continuation of the name Mobtown. And why is it called Mobtown? There's really no mob here. What's the story behind it? So, and through research, started to find that prior to the Civil War, Baltimore was a very bloodthirsty and just nasty, nasty place to be.
And what was the cause? Well, I mean, I know, and we've talked to other people in the past that this was a shipping port, and they built ships here. But was that why it was bloodthirsty, or is there more to it than just that?
There's a little bit more to it than just that. Pretty much the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, you have Baltimore increases its population. It almost quadruples in size. That puts some social strains on. Baltimore was only second to New York and Ellis Island for immigration. So you have a large influx of Germans, Irish coming into the city. That starts to put strains on resources.
Okay.
Housing in particular, jobs, and some tension starts to build. And out of this tension, you start to get bands of young kids that are up to no good. These young kids, pretty much through boredom, start to hang out on street corners, much like today.
Okay.
And it becomes a neighborhood rivalry. Young kids are leaving their apprenticeships. Their attitude towards life is starting to change. Industrialization is starting to happen throughout Baltimore. And if you're working class poor, you're starting to realize that your chance of climbing the ladder is not so great. So this fatalistic attitude starts to kind of prevail through the city. So then neighborhood pride, street corner pride starts to prevail. And this starts to happen throughout the area. These groups of young kids here in Baltimore start to form fishing clubs. And that's just a fancy name for going out drinking and getting in fights. So.
Which people still do nowadays. They just don't call it fishing clubs.
Yeah, people definitely do nowadays. But, yeah, so these young kids, they're starting to realize life is not as wonderful in the new world if they're newly found immigrants. If they're here, their family's already established here. They're starting to see immigrants and free slaves and slaves take their jobs. So Baltimore's starting to rip at the seams, politically speaking. And it's represented by these young kids. Some of these fishing clubs start off with names like the Peelers, the Gumballs, the U-Bolts.
Which sounds innocent enough.
Sounds
the Gumballs.
innocent enough. The Gumballs actually form into arguably one of the most notorious gangs in the history of the United States.
Which one's that?
They become the Plug Uglies.
They become the Plug Uglies. Wow.
The Plug Uglies are a nativist American club that forms in the mid-1850s over on the west side of Baltimore. They tend to ally themselves with the the American Party, which is an anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant party. They call themselves
Okay.
the Know-Nothings, as it's the Know-Nothing movement. The gangs became secretive, and they would have various code words, and it would usually revolve around the term nothing. So somebody would walk up to you, where's Sam? And you would say, I know nothing. And that's how he knew you were a member
Okay.
of one of the various clubs.
And so there was these fishing clubs that turned to gangs.
It turned to gangs. As industrialization starts to happen, less and less apprenticeships are being offered. Kids are going to their job, essentially their 9 to 5. After work to let off steam, they're hanging out with their older brothers or their relatives over at the local saloon. And they're usually not allowed in. They hang out in the street, they get in fights. So it becomes who's the biggest, baddest, who's the toughest, who can steal the most, who's the most brave, who's going to play chicken with a carriage, who's going to jump from building to building. So this kind of bravado starts to happen within the working class. And it becomes a very, very prevalent thing here in Baltimore. Each neighborhood starts to have what is known as fighting men. So as these young fishing clubs start to grow up, they're kind of the minor leagues for what becomes the Baltimore fire gangs and into essentially organized crime.
And what do you mean by fire gangs? How is that different, or how is that differentiate from just a gang itself?
These young kids that are hanging out on street corners tend to congregate around fire clubs. So Baltimore did not have a fire department that was paid for by the city. They had the volunteer fire department.
Okay.
And it consisted of different fire companies. And it was much like today. You would live inside the firehouse. It was a pretty big to-do when there was a fire. So you would have to have everything had to be pulled by the men. So you have large groups of men pulling the fire apparatus to the fire as fast as they can. You have other men carrying hooks, ladders, carrying buckets, whatever is needed. It became a massive spectacle, and as a young kid, it would have been pretty awe-inspiring. They used to have bands that would follow them and play songs. They all dressed the same. It was something to break the monotony of your life, and it started to help bolster neighborhood pride. It also became a criminal enterprise. If you got to the fire first and put it out, you got neighborhood clout. People would buy you drinks everywhere you went. But you also got to rob the place. So it was...
So the people putting out the fire will get to rob the building that they just put the fire out of.
Yes. Technically, again, it's stealing. It is illegal. But who's going to rat on you when you got 300 guys? No, I saw him not taking it. You didn't take nothing. So it starts to turn into this... with good intentions, it starts to turn into a more sinister take on things. And around the 1830s, it starts to be two clubs racing as fast as they can to get to a fire.
Wow.
Now, when they get to the fire, they would fight. There was serious pride going on between the two. Who was better? Who was faster? Who was stronger? Again, it's coming out of the street corners of the little kids and kind of how they're indoctrinated into the system. So people, pretty much up through the 40s, they're fighting in the streets, pitting each other with bricks. There is knives involved. They do use guns at this point, but it's more for effect than actual trying to kill somebody. But they are starting to light fires and arson and set up ambushes. So the fire clubs start to fight each other more and more, and it's starting to get more and more violent.
And okay, so I can imagine if there's a house burning down and two fire companies come and start beating each other up, what happens to the house?
Burns down to the ground, which is very common. It does happen. Often as they're beating each other up, the house would fire, the house next door would fall to the ground, everything would the whole block would be destroyed. And eventually one club would prevail and they would put the fire out. But it was,
3 houses down, 4 houses down.
Now, the young kids hanging out on street corners got involved in this because they had to be the runners. They were the eyes and ears. They were the text messaging, the Twitter of its day. The kids would run as fast as they could to the local fire club plug, put a barrel on top of it, and hold it with, for as long as they could from the other rival kids trying to get to that plug. So,
And I take it the plug is where the fire trucks would plug in to get
correct.
water.
So the kids would race as fast as they could to get there and basically guard it until their club got there.
Wow.
And it became violent. They started to carry guns. They started to carry knives. You're protecting this fire plug. You're protecting this corner. In the meantime, the other young runners are running, saying, okay, the mechanical fire company is coming down Lombard Street. They're just passing, Gay Street. So they're relaying information to the main core group of older volunteer firefighters. And those guys are getting prepared, whether grabbing bricks, knives, being ready to fight, set up an ambush, or break off, set up an ambush while the other group goes and tries to put out the fire.
It almost sounds like it was like a war zone.
It starts to become a war zone. Once politics starts to become involved, now the stakes get raised even more.
And how did it go from firehouses to politics?
Well, politicians started to realize that these young, brave men who are willing to do anything, commit murder, fight, rob, steal, you can use them. And generally, the fire company was from one geographical location. So the Plug Uglies are from Pennsylvania Avenue. So if you're trying to win an election over on Pennsylvania Avenue, you're going to start paying them and giving them money and using them to help your cause. So little kids are passing out so the fire runners, little kids, the fishing clubs are passing out pamphlets and telling people vote this way. And then the firemen themselves are starting to stomp on the street for them. And then on election day, there's a whole other story.
I was going to say, it doesn't seem that sinister to just be like, here, take a flyer, please vote for this person. But you could get pretty much anybody to do that. What is it about? Why would you go to a gang and say, make me win the election?
Well, Baltimore's elections were kind of flawed in and of itself. If you control the area in front of the polling house, you control the election. Politicians realized this, and they started to attach themselves to the larger fire companies, the tougher, the ones with the worst reputations. The New Market Fire Company was the biggest and baddest before the Plug Uglies. So you would attach yourself to those groups because you could intimidate rivals.
Okay.
And as I said, as you progress through hanging out on the street corners in front of the firehouse and fighting on the street every day, you're getting stronger, you're learning, you're applying your trade. You become a professional fighting man. And most of these young kids, that becomes their job. They own a saloon where they can go get drunk, and then they close the saloon and go out and beat people up. That's kind of the progression of things. And
Was
it
it
becomes
lucrative?
It becomes very lucrative for them through various criminal enterprises and also political patronage. If you fight long and hard enough and you get the Democrats into office, they're going to give you a city job.
It sounds like to me, as you were saying that industrialization made all the workers equal, they were working 9 to 5, that this was a way to once again prove their worth if they were able to grow and increase their power.
This bravado again, it becomes, I'm the toughest guy on Pennsylvania Avenue. Much like, things that go on today, it's all about if you have nothing, all you have is your pride. And that kind of starts to really take hold. Now, the politicians see this, and they see this is a weapon they can use. So they start to, again, ally themselves. Down here in Fells Point, you have the Double Pumps. They're a political club that's attached to the Democratic Party. Over on the west side, the Plug Uglies are American Party. New Market Company, Fire Company, that's a Democrat.
Okay.
So the way polling works is you have a window, and you have to make it to that window and hand them a ballot. Your ballot would be, say, it'd be yellow with a black stripe, and that would represent Henry Winter Davis.
Okay.
Or if you had a red one, that would be that you're voting for Abraham Lincoln.
So
you would walk to the window and hand them. So everybody knew who you were voting for.
That's what I was going to say. It's not private like it is today.
Now, the people that were the party that was the current ruling party got to choose where the polling place would be located. So this causes problems again. Infamous neighborhoods, rough neighborhoods, tended to be where they would stick the polling place so that the fire gangs could exert more control.
Jeez.
Now, the way they control the window is the ruling party would have 2 people inside the polling booth and then there would be one challenger standing there. And basically, they would walk up. I would hand them, my ballot and say, I'm Jeff Bejma from the 2nd Ward. I vote for Abraham Lincoln. And then challenger would be like, you don't live in the 2nd Ward, you live in the 3rd Ward. It's a bad vote. And that's how they would kind of control it.
Okay.
Now, the problem with it is you have to get to the window. So if you control the window, the area in front, you control the election. Now, voting is a big deal. People actually care, unlike today. People really go all out to vote in this time frame. Immigrants are just clamoring to go and vote, the chance to vote, the chance to be a citizen and make decisions. It becomes very heated. So the Plug Uglies, the Double Pumps, some of the other street gangs would stand in front of the window with muskets, carpenter awls, knives, bats, pile of bricks. Here in Fells Point on Eastern Avenue, they brought a cannon.
They actually had a cannon.
They pointed it right at the police. So
was going to be a question I was going to ask is, what did the police do? I mean, obviously they are breaking the law in some way or another. They got to be doing something wrong. Why aren't the police stepping in?
Well, again, if you get somebody into office, there was no police department per se at the time. It wasn't this as like you think of it today. There was a police department, but it wasn't as cohesive.
Okay.
They had elected officials. You had your night watchmen. You had your marshals. They were all elected.
Okay.
So if you fought long and hard enough, you could become night watchman of Fells Point. Now you could exert your gang's control over a neighborhood. So when I say policemen, elections had special election police that tended to be fair and impartial. And so they became often the targets of violence.
Okay.
The normal police would just stand there. If their ruling party was in control of the window, they weren't going to do anything. They were.
Wow.
It became a process of keeping yourself in a job.
It's I'm stuttering because it's like you don't learn about this stuff in school. You don't hear about this that they would basically beat people up if you voted wrong. That's not like something that you just normally hear about.
Well, they would do worse than that. They started to they would stab you as soon as you walked up. The carpenter awl became the symbol of the Baltimore election. It was perfect to stab somebody with. So guys would carry them. Guys would make bigger ones, and then they would just, if you had the wrong ballot, they would chase you down the street stabbing you. They would shoot you.
And what, the carpenter awl?
Carpenter awl.
And what's that?
It's it looks almost like an ice pick. It's a long pointed tool used to punch through leather.
Okay.
And it's got a ball, like a bulbous end on it that you can exert a lot of pressure on. They would tape them to their legs, to their knees, to their elbows. It was pretty vicious and violent.
Jeez.
The blood tubs existed over on Butcher's Hill. Used to parade around and say, it's election day, come one, come all, AWL.
Wow.
Now the blood tubs had a nice little practice and where their nickname came from. They were from Butcher's Hill, so there was obviously a prevalence of butchers in the neighborhood.
Right.
They would get animal blood, and if you voted against somebody they didn't want you to vote for, they would soak you in a vat of animal blood, and they would hold you there at the elections, at the polls, and say, don't listen to us, this is what happens to you.
Oh my God. Oh God.
Was Baltimore worse than the rest of the country in this regard?
Baltimore during the 1850s is definitely up there as the murder capital of the country, for sure.
Wow.
When the Plug Uglies come to power, there's a fundamental shift in the New Market Fire Company. Now, the New Market is the biggest and baddest fire company going through the 30s and 40s, up into early 50s. It's just all the training. It becomes a training ground for gangsters, essentially. Everybody involved in it is just rough and tumble. And the Plug Uglies were originally a part of the New Market Fire Company. But there was a political shift. Some guys believed in one thing, other guys believed in another thing, and they went off and formed a fire company called the Mount Vernon Hook and Ladder, and that was over on Pennsylvania Avenue area, Biddle Street. that became the home base for the Plug Uglies.
Okay.
They had a downtown chapter, which became a meeting point for all American Party members. It was Roz Levy's number 11 Holiday Street, which is right by City Hall. That is the site of just nonstop violence for probably pretty much the span of 2 decades.
Really? Wow. Now, we have the gangs, and this. It seems like, well, we don't talk a lot about the gangs now, but was there anybody in the gangs that was very influential in themselves? If you're talking about the big baddies, you say, you know, whoever's the strongest, whoever's the scrappiest, fights the best, gets to the top. Who got to the top?
Well, there's a lot that get to the top in each side. I mean, there's various different groups. So the Plug Uglies, their more notorious members would be John English, James Morgan, John Wesley Gambrell. They're kind of the core, the nucleus. They're Roz Levy, his brother Alexander Levy. They're the brains, the brawn behind it. They're the toughest of the tough in the American fighting system. Then you have Petty Naff, Big Country Thompson. Here in Fells Point, you had George Koenig. George Koenig is probably the first neighborhood boss Baltimore had ever had.
What's a neighborhood boss? I can pretty much guess, but I want to make sure it's.
Well, George Koenig is he's a German, obviously, with the name Koenig. His family actually came here pretty much 1800. He was born just about the end of the War of 1812, so he's a little bit older in the game. He's a little wiser than the young Plug Uglies that are running around. He actually gets involved with the Newmarket Fire Company through some family and friends and neighborhood allegiances. So he starts to learn this trade, and he gets arrested for stealing silk handkerchiefs.
Just handkerchiefs.
Well, silk is expensive. You
So-
can sell it for a lot of money. So he gets arrested. He gets convicted. He's sentenced to 12 years in the penitentiary. He had already been a street brawler at this point, and he's known for his tenacity and never giving up. When he enters the penitentiary, he's already scarred all over the place, so he's already had some running battles. We know this based on his records in the penitentiary. They also have physical markings, scars, tattoos, whatnot.
So you've actually seen the records.
Correct.
Okay.
Down in Annapolis. So George is starting to kind of come up in this era, seeing that he comes from German immigrants as the know-nothings who hate immigrants and hate the Catholics. He's starting to be pushed directly into becoming a Democrat who supported the immigrants and Catholics.
Okay.
Well, he's in the penitentiary. You're often put in the penitentiary for longer periods of time for theft than you are for assault. It's very strange, and even murder.
Really?
If you steal enough, you're going to be in there a long time. And the penitentiary is not a happy place.
But if you kill a man, you can go in a couple of weeks.
It seems that more people are convicted of theft in those days than actual physical murder. Often the guy in murder, they get off on some sort of technicality.
Wow.
And again, that helps perpetuate the violence that is coming in the 1850s. He uses his political powers and his savvy to get out of the penitentiary. He's essentially pardoned, and he gets out. He meets a wife, moves here to Fells Point, and he lives in the heart of the most infamous neighborhood in Baltimore history, which is the Causeway.
And what's the Causeway?
Causeway is Eastern Avenue from Broadway to pretty much Central.
Okay.
It used to be a heavily swampy area, almost waterfront property, and they would have to, the road was essentially like a causeway.
Okay.
Houses would sink. It was much like the 5 Points of New York. It was often referred to as Baltimore's 5 Points.
Okay.
It was the lowest of the low, and it was close right here to the docks. So your captains, your first mates would be drinking down here on Thames Street, and the stevedores, the draymen, the lower level sailors would make their way up to the Causeway.
Okay.
And the Causeway was essentially whorehouse, 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 whorehouse. And George and his wife ran a whorehouse.
Really? It's a family affair.
It was a boarding house.
A boarding
It
house.
was a boarding house.
So he went from being rough and tough on the streets to going to the prison and then running a boarding house.
Yeah, he's not even really that bad yet. He gets convicted again. He gets convicted of stealing during a fire.
Wow.
So he, as a fireman, he gets in trouble, and he goes off for 2 more years. And when he leaves after the 2 years, he is a different man. He's tattooed all over the place. He has anchors on his forearms, weeping tombstones, women, flowers, and he has just more and more scars. And you can see a definite shift in his attitude and things that he starts to do upon getting out. And when he gets out, he becomes the bastard of Fells Point, as the Baltimore Sun liked to refer to him.
And what did he do?
He just started to exert his power. He was a fighting man, so he was constantly involved in the running battles for the Democratic Party. And he established Fells Point and City Dock area and the Causeway as a Democratic stronghold. And there was an American Party club right across the street from him. It was the Roughskins, and the Roughskins and the Plug Uglies, the regulators from downtown, all American Party gangs would come down to Fells Point and pick on the immigrants, and he was the only one to stand up to them. So he becomes kind of a legend down here. He is shot all the time. He is constantly being shot, stabbed. He was hit in the head with an axe, and he always survives.
An axe.
He's hit in the head with an axe.
The blade end, not the.
It's interesting when you're reading old newspaper accounts about him. During the first half of the 1850s, it's a man was shot in the chest and is going to die. And then later on, an update, he doesn't die. And then there's George Koenig was shot again. Chances are he'll die over the next 2 days. Midway through the 1850s, George Koenig was shot again. He's going to survive. Lesser men would die, but not George. He's going to live. And that's pretty much what happens. I mean, you couldn't kill the man.
Well, okay, so I have to ask. Obviously, I would assume he's not still running around Fells Point terrorizing the place. How did he die?
George died an old man.
He died an old man.
With a city job.
Wait, so the bastard of Fells Point died an old man with a city job.
Well, if you put in enough work, you get rewarded. He starts to run the waterfront. He's involved in labor disputes. He is heavily involved in contraband running. There is some note of him being a Shanghaier.
That happened down here too?
Yeah, well, there was one nickname that was Shanghai Town down here in Fells Point.
Wow.
So,
I heard about that on the West Coast, but I hadn't heard about that happening on the East Coast.
it was called crimping here.
Crimping.
Crimping.
Okay.
And it was legal technically. But he would go around kidnapping. He was essentially a mafia boss of the neighborhood. And if the American Party was down here causing trouble, he was the first to tell them to stop. Often he got his butt whooped, but he was always there to stand up and fight for the neighborhood.
So he knew how to take a punch.
He could fight. So he becomes an ardent Democrat, and he's a Southern Democrat. He believes in slavery. Some people say he's the cause of the Pratt Street riot.
What is the Pratt Street riot?
Pratt Street riot is the first death of the Civil War. It's a riot that occurs when federal troops were going to protect Washington after the bombardment of Fort Sumter.
Okay.
And there was a law in Baltimore that you couldn't run the train directly through the city. So the trains had to go into President Street Station here on the end of Fells Point. And yes, it's Fells Point, not Harbor East. On the end of Fells Point. And those train cars would then have to be pulled by horse to Camden Yards to Washington, D.C. And George and the Double Pumps did not want this to happen, and they were, during this court testimony that says while they were at the Customs House, they said that they will do anything to stop it. and they started to lay plans to stop it. And he is heavily involved. It becomes the first death of the Civil War. They start to attack federal troops with bricks, muskets, stab them. You know, a lot of people say, you know, the southern sympathies of Baltimore just would do that. No, it takes a very hardened person to attack federal troops.
Yeah.
It's intimidating.
Yeah.
And the only people that would do that would be these firemen that did this for fun every single day. So I believe he orchestrated pretty much almost the entire thing.
Wow.
He's charged with treason. Miraculously, he escaped that as well. During the Civil War, he, as a runner, a blockade runner, he's charged with treason again for supporting or running contraband down to Southern troops.
Wow.
He starts to calm down after the Civil War, and he only gets involved in minor scrapes. He's shot a couple more times.
He's 89.
He's shot a couple more times, and he allies himself with a man by the name of Doc Slater, another famous Fells Pointer. He was up Upper Fells Point. He's one of the most famous gamblers in the history of the U.S. His gambling hall here in Baltimore was world-renowned.
Wow.
He wanted to get involved in politics, and he had long-running battles with rivals down in City Hall by Old Man Raisin and some other big political influential people. But Koenig was rewarded with becoming a gatekeeper or bridgekeeper here in Fells Point.
Wow. Well, that's not a moral to teach to kids. You know, beat people up enough, kill a bunch of people, get shot a bunch of times. You'll be set up for the rest of your life.
Well, his family was rewarded. His son becomes a U.S. congressman. His grandson becomes a city councilman.
Wow.
His family has done pretty well since. He, through sheer will and violence, established his family and did pretty well with them.
That's incredible. That's so weird, but incredible.
The violence was not always just simplistic violence. Sometimes the violence obviously had a monetary value to it as well as a political means. One of the famous practices here in Baltimore was the coup. And both sides, whether you were a Democrat at the time or a Whig or a nativist American party, you would get involved in cooping people.
And what's cooping people?
Well, as it sounds, chicken coop.
Okay.
What it is they started to realize when you controlled the window, you could control the election. Now let's get people to vote. So about 4 or 5 days before election time, gangs, the police, would go around and find people who appeared to be out of place or didn't belong and kidnap them.
Okay.
They would kidnap them and stick them in a room. Accounts are upwards of 100 people in a room.
Wow. Well, a room, like how big of a room?
I'm not exactly sure
Not
how big.
exactly sure.
There's
But, well,
not-
we've seen all the buildings around Fells Point. They're not exactly large.
10 by 10.
Well, in the process of the coup, you robbed them right when they first got in. So there's a criminal enterprise to it. You beat them, and then you had to make them do what you wanted them to do. So the way that they did this was they would force feed you whiskey. They would drug you. They would take a pint of whiskey and pour it down your throat
Wow.
and try to keep you from throwing it up. They would give you just enough water, just enough food to survive. And after 4 days of this, you became pretty compliant. You were pretty weak.
I can imagine you'd be pretty out of your mind.
Yeah, it would not. It was not a happy situation by any means. They would then, on election day, drag people out 5, 6, 7 at a time at gunpoint, and then give them tickets and say, "Let's go vote." And they would vote them. They would walk them up to a window and make them vote whoever they wanted. They would then go to the next polling house, give them new names, make them vote again to that person. Next polling house, and they would go around the city and run the circuit, voting. Then they would take them back to the coop, make them change clothes. So they would find somebody that was similar in size to them in the coop, and they would swap clothing, make them do it all over again. Make them put on hats, make them do it again. Make them cut their hair, make them do it again.
How many times would they run a person through this?
There's quite a few accounts. There's a guy who was kidnapped here in Fells Point, a German. He was voted 16 times. The belief is that Edgar Allan Poe was voted 33 times.
Wait. Edgar Allan Poe.
Edgar Allan Poe.
Okay. You got to tell me this.
Well, one of the main theories as to how he died is that he was kidnapped.
If I remember correctly, he was found in the street in somebody else's clothes.
Correct.
And there's lots of, theories out there ranging from supernatural to...
Yeah, he was, doing bong hits and
Yeah.
drinking fists of whiskey.
I think I heard one where he had rabies.
Yeah.
But you're saying that might not be the case.
That is definitely, in my eyes, it is not the case at all. He was cooped.
Why do you say that? Other than he was found in another man's clothes, which, sometimes could happen if you drink a lot.
He was also found at a polling house on election day, which was essentially located over by Atman's on Lombard Street between High and Exeter. It was called Gunner's Hall, or Cornelius Ryan's Fourth Ward polls. He is drunk. We know what happened in the coop. Or he was on drugs. We know what happened in the coop, clothing and whatnot. There are quite a few proponents that are against this. They say it didn't happen. They say there's no evidence of cooping happening that day. They have since found newspaper advertisements from the Democrats saying, "Beware of Whig tricks, the coops are active." So, and there's no police reports of cooping happening. But as we know, the cops are probably involved.
Right.
So, or if you're a rookie cop, do you really want to talk about a guy named Roz Levy or George Koenig and testify against him that he cooped somebody? This guy's going to come get you.
Yeah.
He's a boogeyman, and it ain't worth it. You're not getting paid enough to do that.
Well, but that, it sounds plausible, but do you have anything beyond that ties it to Edgar Allan Poe, not just there was cooping this day and he was found? I mean, it's interesting, but it's coincidental.
There's a couple letters that have turned up, essentially, not necessarily taking credit, but saying they were there. There's two letters. One man says he was in the coop with Poe, and Poe was in bad shape. There's another letter that came out from a mysterious Californian from San Francisco. His name was never given, probably because he was afraid of political repercussions. But he was drinking with Poe. And as the story goes, is they were hanging out at the Widow Meager's Oyster House over on Pratt Street, essentially Calvert.
Okay.
Widow Meager loved Poe. She referred to him as the Bard. And, people would come in and have some ridiculous story, and they'd be like, she would cross-reference it with the Bard. Hey, Bard, is that true? Hey, Bard, what about this? Supposedly, he wrote some of his stories on an oyster barrel inside the oyster house.
Okay.
So this was one of his favorite haunts, and we know that he did like to drink. And so as he stops in Baltimore on his way to Philadelphia, he's going to meet up with some old friends over at Widow Meager's. And they're drinking, carousing, having a good time. It becomes a session. They're having multiple drinks. And then they're going to go up the street to another place to have another drink. And the quote is, they walked about 6 squares, and they were accosted. And they were taken over by a fire company and stuck in a coop. There's another letter that a guy named, it's labeled as a certain Pisano, admitted that it was his coop and it was behind the mechanical fire company.
Wow.
Over on Calvert and Mercer Street area. And he supposedly went and apologized to the family and admitted to it.
Really?
The family always said that they believed he was cooped. There are some in his family, for this, that, or the other claim otherwise, but there are people directly very close to him, and they say he was cooped. The letter goes on to say that Poe was voted 33 times, and that he was given a heavy dose of laudanum. And laudanum, obviously being a narcotic, started to have the effects on him. He was a little frail man. I don't think he could handle the process of getting beat up in a coop, the heavy drinking and the force feeding of drugs. He wouldn't make it that long, and he started to fall out as they were driving him around, and they essentially said, he's a dead man. He's no good to us, and they stuck him in a cab and got rid of him.
Wow.
And we know that he's found at Cornelius Ryan's in the street.
But now it's Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe is very famous. Wouldn't they have known that they were grabbing Edgar Allan Poe?
Well, let's go take a look back at our young kids. They're apprentices. They're not schoolboys anymore. They're dropping out of school. Most of them are illiterate. In fact, a lot of the young gangs would hang out at fire halls because they had libraries.
Okay.
They would actually be taught to read and write at the fire hall. They didn't know who Edgar Allan Poe is, nor did they care. All they cared about was their neighborhood. Now, if Edgar Allan Poe grew up in their neighborhood, yeah, they might know who he is.
But because he was stopping through.
Because he was stopping through, they didn't care, nor would they care. They had a job to do. They needed to accomplish the winning of an election, and if he was there, they would have took him. And they were so violent. Even if you were a judge and you knew it was Edgar Allan Poe, are you going to speak up?
We're sitting here horrified and amazed, but we're immigrants to Baltimore. Are Baltimore natives more aware of this kind of thing?
I don't think that Baltimore natives are more aware of it. I get on my soapbox here at the pub and tell people this all the time. People, oh, this is such a cute neighborhood. I'm like, this is the nicest it's ever been. And I kind of give them what it was really like down here. And it kind of leads into, the stories of Mob Town and whatnot. It was a violent place. It was very, very rough. And I think Baltimore doesn't hang on to that stuff too well. It just wants to do away with it. I mean, the moniker of Mob Town is stuck, but how many people really, truly know why?
I can say I always thought it was, when I had heard that it was the murder capital of the country, or one of the murder capitals, I thought it was because of the last couple of decades, or not couple, but within the last century at least.
And it is because of the last century and whatnot. But all right, the 1856 is the split that happens between the New Market and Mount Vernon Hook and Ladder happens. 1856 has a murder rate that is higher than the entire 1840s.
Wow.
So there is a sharp increase in violence, obviously related to this time period and this violence.
Now, there was the movie that was based on the book, The Gangs of New York. And in that movie, if I'm remembering correctly, they had the Plug Uglies up in New York.
It was drawn in comparison, as I understand it.
Okay.
The Plug Uglies are documented 100% to be from Baltimore.
Okay.
The Plug Ugly American Club is from Pennsylvania Avenue. I mean, it is what it is.
So it got so famous that some people thought it was in New York.
Absolutely. They became very, very infamous. They went down to D.C. and caused a riot in D.C. and people were murdered. They were very violent anywhere they went. Herbert Asbury, who wrote The Gangs of New York, was drawing comparison, saying that some of the gangs in the 5 Points were like the Plug Uglies. People, I think, just associated that the Plug Uglies existed. Now, there might have been copycat gangs up in New York that claimed they were the Plug Uglies. Sure, and I believe in the book he also even calls them Irish, which is totally not true.
Wow.
They didn't like immigrants. So, yeah, I think it's just a misconception, and New York's kind of ran with it and grabbed it, obviously, since the movie Gangs of New York and whatnot. But you know, there's copycat stuff. There was a gang here in Fells Point at the corner of Thames Street and Ann Street, and that was the Five Pointers, and obviously the 5 Points was New York, and
Right.
so you know, it is what it is. There's some trading of names and whatnot.
Now, you were saying you had letters of Poe. Do you think that, is there something that you're looking for that's like the clincher, the way of saying, at least if I have this or if I can find this, you can definitely go and say, it'll convince anybody, not just me, except maybe the people who are really, really into the belief that it's something supernatural or something?
You know, I don't know if we'll ever be able to say, you know, definitively that this happened. I mean, I can tell you that, you know, chances are he didn't drink here in Fells Point. I can tell you, you know, little things. A certain Pisano, there was a lettered Pisano who had an arcade over in the Marsh Market, which is Market Street in Pratt. So that's very close to where this area was. So could he have had a coop in that area? Sure. There's not much in Pisano's criminal history to link him to this. So is that him? I don't know. Is there other Pisanos in the area? Sure. So finding criminal records on that, seeing if he's directly linked to the gangs, if he's a member of the New Market, is he, you know, or is he a member of the Mechanical? Like, what is his politics?
Okay.
The other things that we can look at is if this San Franciscan that writes a letter of being there with Poe, if his name was actually found. Is it true? Is he in the neighborhood at that time? There's some debate of whether Widow Meagher's existed. There's pictures of it, though. So
Okay.
we know that it existed, the building, but was her name Meagher, or was it a different name? You know, her name does exist in some city directories, but is that the right person? And so it's, as the internet is growing every single day, so maybe some of this stuff might be found in some rare book that, you know, the Poe Society didn't get a chance to look at, you know. So maybe one day.
Maybe. Yeah, there was about always finding new stuff. I was reading an article the other day, not necessarily about Poe, but just in general, that somebody found this typeface in the bottom of the Thames in England that was like this revolutionary typeface at the time. And the guy's partner was going to steal it from him and print it and make, you know, sell it. So the guy threw it in the Thames, and they recently found it, and it was they actually turned it into a web font. And now it's one of the most popular, sought after fonts. And it's just this weird thing of how over time, you know, it was lost. Yeah. Nobody knew about it until they found it and then went back and did the research. Well, where did this come from?
Poe is one of those figures that is so mysterious, and people, you know, really attach themselves to him. And obviously, Baltimore. Maybe one day they'll find something. I think that the way the gangs started to proliferate the city, it's pretty clear to me as to what happened. When they'll prove it, who knows? You know, this is gang culture. It's tight-lipped. It's, you know, it is what it is, and thankfully, you know, it's not like that here in the city anymore.
You would call yourself an amateur historian, though I don't
Sure.
think that I think that anybody who actually preserves history to the degree that you do, it should be considered a historian. But you don't have like formal schooling in history, do you?
No, I mean, normal college stuff, but I just always liked it, always retained it. Father was huge into it, and it had just stuck, you know. Some kids were out throwing a football with their dad, and my dad's taking me to cemeteries in Detroit, showing me famous bootleggers, you know, and it is what it is. But I have I want to end an argument kind of attitude about things, so I will obsess, and I'll try to find every single aspect of that historical subject that I can get my hands on. I'll read everything about it just to get opposing viewpoints, to learn this, to learn that. And it kind of just starts to morph from there, and especially with the greatest thing in the world that any kid should ever have, and that's a library card.
Now, how do you do your research? Because you don't necessarily have like an academia behind you giving you grants to go out. Anybody could do this, right?
Absolutely.
This is something, what do you do?
Well, first and foremost, kids, get a library card. Now, the Enoch Pratt Library, just to start, if you don't have time or don't want to deal with Baltimore parking over downtown, you can go online and use your library card number and start looking through their files that they have. And how I learned some interesting stories of Fells Point is the Baltimore Sun Archive.
Okay.
And it's just reading the first-hand sources, so reading the newspapers, and then getting a name. And so, let's say I get a name, George Koenig. Then I can go over to Maryland Historical Society. Oh, Melton wrote a great piece on Koenig. Read that. Okay, there's a name in there. So this guy worked with Koenig. Who's he? Go cross-reference that to the Baltimore Sun. See what he owned. Does he have an advertisement? Oh, he was a rope maker on Broadway. Okay, what happened there? Type that address in. It starts to just kind of morph and grow and grow. And it's just investigating. It's just learning every little bit you can about each person. And then the picture starts to kind of paint itself at that point. I wish there was more buildings preserved where you can actually touch it and see it. There's not many pictures.
Okay.
So you kind of got to use your imagination or really go down to crime records. I mean, they're wonderful.
But they're available to
in
everybody.
Annapolis, you have your penitentiary records.
Okay.
So you can see that, George Koenig was 5'10" with blonde hair, blue eyes. So now you're starting to paint a picture. He had tattoos of anchors on his left forearm. So they're keeping those records in for, penitentiary's sake. But that paints a picture for you, and then you can kind of start going from there. And then you start looking at the other, his rival, James Manley. What did he look like? And so
Right.
That's just kind of how it all would start. And then as you start researching that way, you start to find different names, you start to find different addresses, different things, and it's just kind of all starts to morph together. And
Now, sorry. With the addresses, if I'm not mistaken, we had another interview a long time ago where we talked about insurance maps with another person. That's something that you have to take into account, is that the addresses change?
Absolutely. Originally, like Fells Point, okay, we are currently at 1700 Thames Street. Pre-1877, our address would be 90 Thames Street. So there is a change, and it happens, I believe, after 1855. There is online, you can find the re-enumeration, as it's called, of the city. It's a little hard to find, but you can locate it, and it'll have the old address and the new address. So that changes things. A lot of people talking about Poe assume he was found downtown. He wasn't. He was found over in Mechanics Row, Little Italy, Lombard Street. So just finding those addresses and changing them, and then giving you a real idea as to where it's at. You can then use your insurance maps. The Sanborn insurance maps are great. You can really get an idea of what's in the area. Some of the buildings are labeled on them. Actually, we're sitting in I believe in 1877, right where we are right now, was a lead paint factory. So it burned down, but I learned that from Sanborn Insurance Map. I also learned that, right now we're looking at the water. This was not waterfront property originally. So you get to get a bigger picture of what things used to be, what the buildings used to be. Then you can even find if the building in question does it still exist. And then you can go to the city and look up deeds, look up who owned that through history. Run that name through the Baltimore Sun. Run that name through the internet and see if you can find anything else. So it just kind of morphs and grows and grows.
And you can do it from your home for some of it, and a good portion of it, it sounds like.
A good portion of it. I mean, always going up to the Maryland Historical Society downtown is a wonderful experience.
And anybody can do that.
You can go in. Their library, I believe it's located downstairs. There is a fee. It's not much. It's a couple of bucks. But it's absolutely wonderful, and the staff there is incredible, and they'll help you. You might get lucky and run into somebody that's already wrote a book on it, something like that. You know, I would love to sit down and have a beer with an author named Tracy Matthew Melton. He wrote a book, The Hanging of Henry Gambrell, which is all about the Plug Uglies, and that kind of started me looking into the fire laddies and the gangs of yesteryear. So his book is actually a Maryland Historical Society book. So.
Now, is there anything you're working on? Are you still just researching this, or what's your current research sending you into?
I was teaching over in Westport, and somebody that worked there pointed out to me that there was a famous boxer buried over in a cemetery by Westport Elementary School, and forgot about it, didn't pay attention to it, and I'm a boxing junkie, so I started looking into it a little bit later, and it's the great Joe Gans. Joe Gans, I would compare him to Sugar Ray Robinson, somewhat modern day, Sugar Ray Leonard.
Okay.
I would also compare him to Floyd Mayweather.
Okay.
Very, you can't knock me out if you can't hit me, So it was very precise. Joe Louis would be, if you watch a video of Joe Louis, very precise movements, very short punches. Everything is very, very thought out. And it almost looks slow because it's so methodical. And that style of fighting was taught to Joe by Chappie Blackburn, who fought and got beat up by Joe Gans. So one of the first things I did when I moved here actually was go visit Joe Louis over at Arlington. So my grandfather fought out of the same gym and actually sparred with Joe Louis. And then I come to find out that he's a Fells Point boy. And so that piqued my interest even more. So he was an oyster shucker at the Broadway Market. This is turn of the century, 1900. He's an oyster shucker. He lived over by currently Perkins Projects on Bank Street. And while he was working at as an oyster shucker, the guy that owned the place would practice the mitts with him.
Okay.
And here's this young black man that starts to take an interest in boxing. And apparently Fleet Street was huge in the boxing world. There was some famous gyms. There was some champions that used these gyms. There was a boxing club on Fleet Street, and he started to go there after the gentleman taught him mitts in the market. And he started to kind of rise up, and then the promoter had a restaurant on the corner of Broadway and Fleet Street, and he started to see some promise. Unfortunately, Joe obviously had to deal with a lot of racism. He was involved in the horrible battle royale, and he started to make a name for himself in that. It's where they would take 10 young black kids, blindfold them, put them in a ring, and last man standing wins, $3, $5.
Wow.
Horribly racist, and he used to win the battle royale quite often. And so his name kind of, people would come watch the battle royale over at the local theaters downtown, and he kind of came up that way. And then there was a famous fight promoter that had a restaurant right there. So it just happenstance that this young kid is right place, right time. And Joe Gans goes off to be the first black champion of anything.
Wow. Of anything.
Yeah, he's pre-Jack Johnson. He trained Jack Johnson.
Wow.
You always hear about Jack Johnson,
Yeah.
but Joe Gans should be a focus. He's incredible. If you look at it, he invented the modern style of boxing. Nobody did it until him. His record, people don't really know exactly for sure, but he was like 160-11 with 100 knockouts.
Wow.
He's enters into the conversation of pound for pound greatest of all time. He's definitely the greatest lightweight of all time. Fought the longest fight in history. I'm starting to learn all this ridiculous stuff about a man I had no clue.
And he grew up here.
And he's a Baltimore boy.
Wow.
And there is no mention of him anywhere. There's a little plaque to a hotel that he owned up on the east side here. But I feel there should be something here in Fells Point. There should be something at the market to a guy that accomplished that much.
It seems like through history, unless you're a president or a general or something, it seems like a lot of people get swept under the rug.
Well, I'll sit and debate it over a glass of whiskey any day of the week and get people educated on it.
That's awesome. It seems like in Fells Point in Baltimore, there's this idea around this time that the stronger you are, the harder you fight, the farther you can get.
I believe that. Just like George Koenig, it's an immigrant neighborhood. I moved to this neighborhood from Detroit because I typed in Polish neighborhood, Baltimore. And, there was it's an immigrant neighborhood. I was blown away when I first saw it. I'm like, oh my God, the Polish did good here. But anywhere where you have immigrant neighborhoods, you're going to have that, hey, we're here. We're going to have to carve out our own place, and it's going to be rough and tumble, and you're going to fight for everything you have, and it's not a bad thing.
Well, thank you for sitting down with us, and I feel like we should probably say where we are because you were nice enough to open it to us. So
we're at Solange Irish Pub right here in the heart of Fells Point. We also own Cooper's Tavern.
Well, thank you for opening the doors and sitting down with us and giving us the nitty-gritty on the area and in Baltimore.
Absolutely, no problem.